Hi everyone, today we are going to get familiar with equivalence partitioning. We will quickly go through the theory, like 1 to 2 minutes, and then we'll resolve 4-5 questions from ISTQB sample exam tests. Be ready, I will read next 2 slides out loud, and you will feel like we are learning some aerospace engineering. This is an example of the thing which is extremely easy in practice and not understandable in theory. Be strong for 2 minutes. Let's begin. Equivalence partitioning. A black box test technique in which test cases are designed to exercise equivalence partitions by using one representative member of each partition. Equivalence partition. A portion of the value domain of a data element related to the test object for which all values are expected to be treated the same based on the specification. Let's get familiar with main principles of this technique. Divide a set of test conditions into groups or partitions where all elements of the set can be considered the same, so the system should handle them equivalently. Test only one condition from each partition. An equivalence partition containing valid values is called a valid equivalence partition. If one condition in a partition works, we assume all of the conditions in that partition will work. An equivalence partition containing invalid values is called an invalid equivalence partition. If one of the conditions in a partition does not work, then we assume that none of the conditions in that partition will work. When values from valid partitions are used in test cases, they can be combined with other valid values in the same test, as the whole set should pass. When values from invalid partitions are used in test cases, they should be tested individually, that is, not combined with other invalid equivalence partitions, to ensure that failures are not masked. Applying to more than numbers. For example, if you are booking a flight, you have a choice of economy, business or first-class tickets. Each of these is an equivalence partition in its own right and should be tested. The invalid partition would be an attempt to type in any other type of flight class, for example staff. Let's check ISTQB test, and during resolving the test we will get back to these principles and everything will become clear. Pause the video and read the text on your own. It is very simple test, and I bet you already know the answer. Because it is simple, it is good example for explanation. Our first principle is, divide a set of test conditions into partitions. In our test, it is already done in the description. Each of these conditions is a partition. So we have 4 defined partitions in total. But our goal is to check if anything is missed in the description. Because of that I always do additional work. When we need to deal with numbers, my approach is to draw a line of values. On the graph we can easily see partitions and values which are included there. For example, first partition, less than or equal to 2 years. We don't have specified from value, so I called it min. 2 value is an easy one. We know that 2 years should be included in the partition 1. Filled circle means value is included in the partition. These are boundaries of partition 1. If we will go to partition 2 we will face new problem. More than 2 years but less than 5 years. We don't have exact information about from date. Is it 2 years and 1 day, 2 years and 1 millisecond, or even 3 years? We don't know. But it is not a problem for our particular test and we shouldn't care too much about it. Because of that I draw an empty circle. Which means that 2 years value is not included in the second partition and this partition will start from the next available value after 2 years. Same I did with 2 value, 5 years. And this value is also not included, and second partition will end with the nearest value, below 5. Same principle applies for partitions 3 and 4. We have 4 visible valid partitions now. In general, we need to find invalid partitions also. But we don't have enough information to do that. And lack of information is explained by description. We are asked only about valid partitions. Invalid values can be skipped in this particular test. And the first task is resolved, divide a set of test conditions into partitions. Second principle is, test only one condition from each partition. In our case, there are 4 partitions, and at least one test case must be created for each equivalence partition. It means that valid answer is D. I bet you are unhappy, and you have a questions, which you want to ask, and receive appropriate answer. Like, what is the exact max and min values? Or how to define exact from for partition 2. Is it 2 years and 1 day or 3 years? What about invalid partitions, why we haven't defined them? These questions are valid questions, and on the real project it is required to ask them and receive an answer. Based on the answer you will be able to provide appropriate level of testing. But now our goal is to pass the ISTQB exam and resolve its tricky questions. When you resolve ISTQB test you should not overthink this. Because all that information is skipped for a purpose. And the purpose is to mislead you. Not enough information makes it harder to resolve the question. So you need to read description very carefully and try to do the minimum needed. We are asked about valid partitions, so you don't care about invalid partitions, exact boundaries, min, and max values. All what you need is to check if you have defined all valid partitions, that's all. Let's resolve more tests related to equivalence partition technique. Let's check this simple test. It will help us to understand that equivalence partitioning is not only about range of numbers. Pause the video and read the text on your own. First of all, we need to divide a set of test conditions into partitions. As in previous question, it is already done in requirements. Each of these values is an equivalence partition on its own. We don't need to draw lines or something. Which leads us to the additional principle, equivalence partition is a technique which can be applied to more than numbers. You can say that we have numbers here. But instead of the screen resolution, we could have a list of devices. For example, phone, tablet, laptop and TV. In that case you will still need to test on each device. You need to remember that one value on its own can be an equivalence partition. Next thing which we need to do is to test only one condition from each partition. We have 4 partitions, that means we need to test all of them. Because of that the valid answer is C. Now, when basic rules are more clear, let's check more complex question. I had this kind of question on my real exam. Pause the video and read the text on your own. Remember, no matter if question is big or small, looks like easy one or complex one. When question is related to the equivalence partition, first thing which you need to do is to divide a set of test conditions into partitions. And when you have range of values, I recommend drawing it. Then it is easier to see if something is missed and which value relates to which partition. We have 5 partitions in total. Let's check first partition. Again, min value is not specified. Because of that I left it as min. And we see that it says up to 1000, because of that we can't be sure if 1000 value relates to the first partition or second partition. But second partition says above 1000, which can't include 1000 value. Because of that we know that 1000 value relates to the first equivalence partition. Same principle applies to 4 next partitions. We again are not sure about min and max value. Which is done on purpose because ISTQB is tricky. And again we don't have enough information to define invalid classes. Which is done by purpose. We are asked about equivalence partition coverage. If we check syllabus, we will know that to achieve 100% coverage with this technique, test cases must cover all identified partitions, including invalid partitions. Coverage is measured as the number of equivalence partitions tested by at least one value, divided by the total number of identified equivalence partitions. Based on that explanation, we can be confused with this test. Because we need to know valid and invalid partitions to measure coverage. As I told you, we don't have enough information to find invalid partitions. Theory is very high level. And can't help with the test. Important to not overthink this. And when I face tests like this, I check answers. Sometimes it helps to have a better context. Let's check answers attentively. As you see, there are no characters, letters, decimal numbers or negative numbers. All of these numbers are included in our defined partitions. That means for me that invalid partitions are not important. All what we need is to count which answer covers the highest number of partitions, that's all. And all what we need to focus is to define our partitions correctly. Because you see that there are values from the edges. Like 1000, 2000, 4001. One number which confuses me is 0. It can be invalid partition, it can be partition on its own. I don't have enough information in the description, so I need to assume that it is the valid number and is included in the partition number 1. I can't be 100% sure. But I can't get more info from the description, so I need to guess. Now we can check each answer individually. As we decided for now, 0 is related to the partition number 1. Same with 1000 value. Both numbers cover only one partition. 2000 is related to the partition number 2. It covers second partition. 3000 is related to the partition number 3. 4000 as well. Again, only one partition is covered. In total we have only 3 partitions covered. 1, 2 and 3. In total we have 5 partitions. Which means that our coverage is 60%. It is easy. So I'm not going to show other 3 answers in those details. Once you will check it, then you can see that only one answer covers 4 partitions. It is still not the best, because 2 values 666 and 999 covers 1 partition. And partition number 2 is missed. But we are asked to find the best option from what we have, not in general. Because of this, the right answer is D. I know that is not what you expected. You don't want to guess or have assumptions. Because exam costs money, and you need right answers, not conclusions. You can find this interesting explanation in their book. A very important task of the tester. Not only do we test what is in our specification, but we also think about things that have not been specified. We have made an assumption here about what the smallest difference is between 2 values. We have assumed 2 decimal places. We have also made an assumption about exactly which amount starts the new interest rate. Basically they say that we need to do those assumptions. And on the real project, it is truth. Sometimes we need to work in that way. But it is not okay when you resolve test on the exam. In my opinion, they shouldn't write tests with assumptions. If it is test, it should be more obvious. For example, put here value 1, instead 0. If they think that it is too easy, then it shouldn't be a test, maybe video call where you can explain your thoughts. But we can't do anything about that. It is not going to happen, so we don't need to waste our time to think about it. All what we can do is to resolve these tests and try to understand their logic. The more tests we resolve, the easier it will be to deal with the next one. Let's check the most complex test related to the equivalence partitioning next. Let's check this question. When I read it first time I didn't understand what I need to do at all. I had exactly the same question, but with different values on my real exam. Pause the video and read the text on your own. As I've told before, when question is related to the equivalence partitioning technique, first thing we need to do is to define equivalence classes. We can ignore this section for now. Let's find out how many equivalence partitions we can define. We have 2 values base on which we can identify equivalence classes. First one is the number of hours a plant is exposed to the sun. Values are below 3 hours, 3 to 6 hours, or above 6 hours. Based on that, we can identify 3 partitions related to the hours. Second value is the average intensity of the sunshine. It can be very low, low, medium and high. It leads us to the principle applying to more than numbers. Because of that, each of these values can be a partition on its own. And we can identify 4 partitions related to the intensity of the sunshine. We have 7 partitions in total. Those are only valid partitions. And again, we don't care about invalid partitions, as it is said in the description. This simplifies our job. Now, when we have defined equivalence classes, we need to check how many of them are covered by the test cases which are given to us in the table. Let's start. Test case number 1. Number of hours, 1.5. Intensity, very low. We don't care about score, it is given to mislead us. This test case covers partition number 1, as value 1.5 hours is in the range below 3 hours. And it covers partition number 4. Very low value is an equivalence partition on its own. This means that test case number 1 covers 2 partitions out of 7. This leads us to one more principle. When values from valid partitions are used in test cases, they can be combined with other valid values in the same test, as the whole set should pass. Let's check test case number 2. Number of hours, 7. Intensity, medium. This test case covers partition number 3, as 7 hours value is above 6 hours. And partition number 6, because medium value is a partition on its own. And the last test case number 3. Number of hours, 0.5. Intensity, very low. This test case covers same partitions as test case number 1, partition number 1, below 3 hours, and partition number 4, very low intensity. Now we can see that by 3 test cases, only 4 partitions are covered. And partitions 2, 5, and 7 are not tested. We are asked to identify the minimum number of additional test cases that are needed to ensure full coverage. And we know that we have 7 equivalence partitions in total. And 4 of them are covered. Let's find out how many test cases we need to add to cover last 3 partitions. And we know that we can combine valid values in the same test. Because of that, I propose 2 additional test cases. Test case number 4. Number of hours, 4.0. Intensity, low. Which will cover partition number 2, 3 to 6 hours. And partition number 5, low intensity. And test case number 5. Number of hours, 6.5. We don't really care about number of hours because those partitions are already covered by test cases 1, 2, 3 and 4. But we care about intensity. And in this test case we cover the intensity high, which is the 7th, the last not covered, equivalence partition. We had 3 given test cases and identified 2 more, test cases number 4 and 5. Because of that, the right answer is B. We need 2 additional test cases to ensure full coverage of all valid input equivalence partitions. In all the previous tests that we reviewed before, we did not have the necessary information to identify negative classes. This was because we were only asked about valid partitions. This is the only test I have found which can show to you how the test with negative equivalence classes would look like. Pause the video and read the text on your own. As usual, we need to start from divide a set of test conditions into partitions. We don't have a lot details in the description. Because of that, we can find only one equivalence class. We know that these values 0.1 and 50.0 are included in the valid partition. That's all. Let's check the answers now. We can see that there are values which are out of our equivalence partition, which we just defined. 0.0, 60.0, 70.0, you can see those in the each answer, A, B, C and D. It is impossible that all answers are wrong. Only one explanation is that we need to define additional partitions or equivalence classes based on the answers which we have. We can add 2 additional equivalence classes. And we again will need to guess. First negative equivalence partition is clear. 50.1 and above. Which covers values like 60, 70, or 50.1. But second one is not obvious. 0.0 can be partition on its own. Or this partition can include 0.0 and negative numbers. I guess negative numbers can be excluded because of this sentence. The keypad only allows the entry of digits. It means that user physically can't enter anything below 0.0. That is why I put this as partition on its own. Second reason why I did it. Because I don't see negative numbers in any of these answers. Only in the answer D. And I already see that it is invalid answer. Because it has more than one test case for the valid equivalence class. Now when we finished with divide a set of test conditions into partitions, we need to find which of the answers follow the next principle, test only one condition from each partition. Let's check answer A. 0.0 relates to the first partition. As we decided that it is partition on its own. 20.0 relates to the second partition. As value is in range of the valid numbers. And 60.0 relates to the third partition. When invalid amount of gallons is selected, most likely it is our answer. But remember that ISTQB is tricky test, because of that we need to check all answers. When we check answer B, we see that it has 2 test cases for one partition, and this contradicts the principle, test only one condition from each partition. Because of that answer B is invalid answer. Exactly the same reason for the answer C. We have 2 tests for one equivalence partition. And exactly the same reason for the answer D. We have 4 tests for one equivalence partition. I know that for boundary value analysis, answers C and D can be correct answers. It depends of the 2-point or 3-point boundaries you are asked to use. And of course, more testing is better, so on real project you would like to test these values also. But we are asked, which of the following is a minimum set of desired amounts that covers the equivalence partitions for this input? Question relates only to equivalence partitioning test technique, and we are asked about minimum number of tests. That's why answer A is the correct one. That's all on my side. In this video we have learned all principles of the equivalence partitioning technique and saw each of them in the tests. Also we learned that there are no universal approach and each test has its own specific. Reason of that is because ISTQB in their book says that some things we need to guess. And it is very hard to guess when you need to deal with complex theory. In my opinion, on the real project, it is easier to use these techniques. Anyway, I hope this will help you to successfully pass the exam. And we'll see you in the next video. Good luck. If you are watching this video, you are most likely looking for answers to 2 questions. How to prepare and pass the ISTQB Foundation Level exam? And how long will it take? Let's quickly find the answers to these. First of all, let's find out what the exam looks like. The exam shall comprise 40 multiple choice questions. Each correct answer has a value of 1 point. A score of at least 65%, 26 points or more, is required to pass. The time allowed for each examination is exactly 60 minutes. Let's check exam sample. As you see, 40 questions in total. Each question has value of 1 point. And each question has 4 possible answers. A, B, C, and D. And only one is correct. Some questions are quite easy. Like these. Other questions are extremely complex. Like this one. And one more thing, which we need to know before answering our questions, is that there are 6 chapters in the foundation level, Chapter 1, Fundamentals of Testing, and so on, and each chapter is divided to sections, like, what is testing, and so on. This is the fastest possible overview of the ISTQB Foundation Level exam. Without it, I can't answer those 2 questions correctly. Let's find the answer to question number 1. How to prepare and pass the ISTQB Foundation Level exam. First, what you need to do is to read a relevant material for the test preparation. It is not a problem. You can read a book written for that purpose by the authors of the exam. It is also divided to the 6 chapters and each chapter to appropriate section. And second thing which you need is a lot experience of resolving tests. As you saw, exam consists of 40 questions divided to these 6 chapters. Because of this, I designed my course in the same way. So you can resolve questions based on not even chapter, but the section of the chapter. Theory is complex, there are a lot of classifications, terms, definitions, diagrams and classifications. So this approach will be the most effective to take it with small pieces. Read a section in the book or syllabus. Then you can resolve questions related only to that section. I have passed the exam again in November 2020 and updated all questions to meet the new theory and be as similar to the real ones as possible. Once you will finish to read a book and resolve questions for all 6 chapters, you would be able to train with around 10 exam samples. Again based on the rules which we already know. Based on the time you are able to dedicate, preparation shouldn't take more than couple of weeks. All of this you'll be able to find in this course. So, if you are interested to pass the exams successfully, welcome to this journey.